All right, let's take a look at different ways that we can tackle this problem. Crossing database context can be a tricky thing, but it can be very, very useful to do. So I am now, let's look at the file that I'm in. I am now in the O2 solution file for this challenge. Let's look at sample solution 1. So I've got 3 in here. Our first sample solution 1 uses the built-in stored procedure SPExecute SQL. SPExecute SQL can be really, really useful when doing dynamic SQL because it allows you to parameterize queries. Much like a stored procedure, you can specify parameters, and this allows reuse of execution plans. The cons are the syntax when you're using these parameters, and you can do input parameters and output parameters. It's great, but I've used this thing, I don't know, hundreds of times, maybe even thousands of times, probably more in the hundreds, but I still get confused about the syntax and have to go look at the examples in books online because it's just not that straightforward. Now, it doesn't take me that long to look them up in books online, but I do think that the syntax is definitely not easy for most of us to remember. So I'm going to go ahead and first just create this sample solution. I went ahead and did create or alter on this first one. Oh no, we want to be back in sample solution 1. I was a little overeager on my scroll, and I'm now going to expand it. So I've already got it in the database there. I executed twice just for good measure, right? In the variables here, I just declared one extra variable. This variable is named DSQL, and I've said it is Unicode variable character max. SPExecute SQL, that built-in procedure, it doesn't like varchar. It wants Unicode to go into it. So that's one thing about when you're using dynamic SQL with it, you need to do Unicode. I have a personal habit of whenever I declare dynamic SQL, I like to initialize it as an empty string. This is a Unicode empty string indicated by the capital N. And I do that because sometimes when I'm doing dynamic SQL, we end up concatenating things, saying I want to combine this string with something else. If I didn't say this equals empty string, by default it would be set to null. And if you combine null and a string, you get null. So I just have a habit. If I'm going to do anything for dynamic SQL and I'm declaring a variable, I try to remember to always initialize it as empty string so that if I do concatenate, I'm not going to be concatenating null and then being like, why isn't this working? Why is my dynamic SQL string empty? That is the only extra thing I have declared. We already had the results temporary table. We already had the database name. We declare our cursor here just like before. We fetch next. So here is the code where I'm adding. Now, first, let's go over some things that doesn't work. So actually, I will need to recreate this. So I'm going to go ahead and first off, I'm going to comment out the solution I'm going to show to you here. And we might think, like one of the things you may have tried if you haven't done this before is that in the body of the procedure, we could just say, oh, I'm going to use the variable database and then I'm going to run the procedure. Well, use database statements are not allowed in procedures, functions, or triggers, so it isn't that simple. So let's comment that out. Another thing that doesn't work, I might try this. Well, I want to execute this procedure just in the database that's in that variable, right? So I might try to just put that as the name. Well, see this little dot underline here? It's like incorrect syntax. I can't do this. If I try to compile the procedure this way, I'm going to go ahead and just highlight the whole thing and running there. I get, yeah, that wasn't just IntelliSense lying to me. That was actually true. That syntax is not allowed either. There is a kind of shortcut I'm going to show you in sample 2 that's kind of close to that, but just this simplicity doesn't work. One solution that does work is using that dynamic SQL to call the procedure. So at the beginning, I declared DSQL as a variable and I set it to an empty string. Here I'm saying I want to set the dynamic SQL to the database name plus dot the schema name dot the procedure name. And then I'm going to say P1, the parameter it takes, is called fill me in please. Now you might say, what the heck is fill me in, please? Fill me in, please is something I just made up here because I am going to, this is a parameter I'm using in SP execute SQL. Here is my call to SP execute SQL right below there. I'm saying I want SQL Server to execute this SQL. This statement it's going to run is DSQL. So if we look up here, here is DSQL. DSQL is the database name plus DBO, the schema plus the procedure name, passing in that. I also want to pass in some parameters. This is where SP execute SQL lets you define things. And I've said in this statement represented by Unicode DSQL, it does require these all to be Unicodes. There is a parameter I've provided in there that I have named fill me in, please. The data type that it takes is int. In this params thing, that's where I'm defining that parameter. Then, after that, the third parameter I'm passing in says, fill me in, please. The value I want to use for that equals P1. Now, if I wanted to use a hard-coded value, I totally could. I don't have to use a parameter, right? I could say it's 111, and that would work if I wanted to use that, but I can specify it as a parameter that is known in my procedure. If I changed the name of this in the query to fill me in, please, 2, I would need to say, oh, in my parameter, actually, that's the name of it here, and then I would need to change it here. All of those need to match. So I'm going to leave this at fill me in, please, 2 for now, and let's go ahead. This is where the sample, the part I changed ends. The rest of it is just as you had it there. So let's compile this now with my changes in there. And first, we're going to run this for P1 equals 128. And sure enough, I get the results I wanted back. For each database, it said 128. If I run it now for P1 equals 2, that gets passed through as well. Let's go ahead and look at the actual execution plans. I'm going to turn on up here, turn on my actual plan button just so we can see what it's doing. And of course, when we're looking at actual plans when looping, it's going to show us a plan for every loop. So if I was looping through like 5,000 things, I might crash Management Studio, right? If I was looping through 100 things, I might even crash Management Studio. But I'm looping through, just a very small set of things, so it's okay in this case. We can see that we get plans for things like opening the cursor, right? Everything we're doing here, and we've got lots of different steps here. Here is our insert results part of that. Here's where it's running SP execute SQL, and we can see, this is where it's putting things into results there. If I hover over the table insert here, we can see the object that's happening there. If we hover over the parameter table scan here, we've got that the parameter table scan here outputs the database and P, right? So it's a little mysterious looking at it here, but we can, in the comments, see, yes, this is running the stored procedure SP execute SQL as query 7. So we can see a bit about what we're doing, which is pretty cool. Now this, the fact that this can be parameterized can be great for dynamic SQL because it makes it like a stored procedure. In other words, I am reusing execution plans for every time I run this bit of this string, execute database name.dbo.call me. Maybe it is going to, my plan can get reused. I am going to have a separate plan in each database. But, if I run this procedure with 128 and then 2 and then 59 and then 65, each of those within each database will reuse the execution plan. And that's great if this was called frequently. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and reset this. So in the initial challenge, right, it's just please, it's not please to. We do need to, in fact, change that on every occurrence of it there so they match. Oh, yeah, I missed a 2 there somehow. Yeah, so we don't want any 2s there. And now let's go ahead and save it. And we'll go ahead and compile it and make sure, we'll prove that it works both ways. We'll make sure that I haven't messed it up. So yes, that still works. All right, let's go ahead and turn off our plans. Now, our second choice is a little different, and or a second solution. We're going to use the procedure name as a variable in this one. And this one is my favorite one for this specific problem. The pro here is nice and simple syntax. I really like the simplicity of this. So I'm going to go ahead and create it before I show it to you. In this case, I do not actually need to declare a dynamic SQL parameter. There is no DSQL parameter here, but I'm kind of cheating. I've declared a variable named procname. Now, I'm declaring a variable, but it's to hold a very special kind of dynamic SQL. So I would describe this as dynamic SQL, but notice that it is saying sysname. This is going to hold a system named object. Now, that is just an alias for Unicode variable character below a certain length. It's going to hold a three-part name of the procedure object. So we could debate on whether this is true dynamic SQL or not. It solves a dynamic problem. Right, so here's what this does in the middle. So in procname, we are setting the procname to the database plus the schema plus call me maybe. And then this is a really cool thing that SQL Server lets us do. And I was inspired to write this challenge because I think I've forgotten that SQL Server has let us do this for a long time. And I'm pretty sure I've forgotten at least on 3 separate occasions and relearned that we can do this. So I was like, no, I should actually really do a SQL challenge that points this out. Because we can't use DB. We can't execute the database variable schema name procname. We can't combine a variable into the procname, but we can set the whole procedure name into a variable and then just say exec procname and then pass in the parameter, and it will be executed in the context of that database. And this is why I have that selecting the DB name in there, because selecting DB name says in my current context, select the name of the current database. So we'll actually see that in the results there. We then continue on with the cursor as normal. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this runs. I've already compiled this one, and let's loop through the databases for 128. And sure enough, we get back all of our databases and we get back 128. And for each database, it's giving us the name of that. Let's go ahead and run it for P1 equals 2. We're getting that as well. So I'm now going to turn on my actual execution plans. And we are still running, by the way. We're still going through in each database. We're going to get a plan for this, and it's going to get reused in each database because we are just putting the name of the procedure into a variable. It's going to get executed always with the exact same text in each database where, we're still using a parameter right here. So let's look at, I have the actual plans on. Let's look at the plan for this and see what's happening in there. And we're opening our cursor and we are inserting, here we go. We are inserting, now it's in query 3 here. We are inserting into results exec procname P1 equals P2. And now if we hover over the table insert, that is results. And on our parameter table scan, we've got at the very bottom of it, it said the columns that were coming out there. So I really like this one for the simplicity. If we simply want to dynamically access procedures in other databases and use the same, we do want to use the same variable in each one, setting the entire name of the procedure, a 3-part name, into a variable, and then executing that variable can be really, really effective. All right, the third way to do this, and this is my least favorite way, although it depends on how, the goodness or badness depends on how you use it. So I'm going to say maybe not a huge problem in this case. And the real issue isn't just that it's 6 statements only, it's that we are only running it twice per database. Running. I can't spell running. 2x per db, but can be problematic. And let's talk about why that is. All right, I'm going to go ahead and create or alter the procedure. And then let's go ahead and open this up. So in this one, I have this time declared DSQL as a variable. And no, I'm not using SP execute SQL in this one though. Instead of SP execute SQL in the body of this, I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm just using exec. What I've done here, this is commonly an anti-pattern in dynamic SQL. I'm saying, but like anything else, sometimes it can be the right choice. So it is often an anti-pattern, but sometimes it's the best choice depending on what's going on. Confusing, right? This time I'm setting a string to be. I'm executing database name.dbo.callmemaybe. And I'm saying pass in P1, but then instead of, like in the SP execute SQL one, I said, no, I created a parameter that was handled by SP execute SQL. That was what? Fill me in, please. This time I'm not saying fill me in, please. I'm saying I want to cast P1 as a Unicode character string that I can just add to this string. And then I want to close off my string. So let's go ahead and let's go ahead and add a print statement here just so we can see what's going on. So just a debugging step here. I'm going to print out the dynamic SQL that's going to run each time on this one. I'm still going to go ahead and execute the dynamic SQL and have it insert the result into that table. So let's go ahead, since I've changed this, let's go ahead and make sure I have the fresh one here. We'll go ahead and rerun this. And we'll collapse it there. If we run this for P1 equals 128, I have my execution plans on there, that's fine. Notice that SQLChallenge db1.dbo.callmemaybe, I'm running P1 equals 128. And by the way, I should have done set no count on in each of the procedures that I created in each database. It's a good thing to not have your procedures always returning counts. It's in testing, it hasn't been shown to have a huge amount of overhead, but I do think it generally makes things better to have done that. So I should have done that in each of those procedures in each individual database, but I also wanted to just keep the code as simple as possible so that you didn't have a lot to look through. So it's difficult balancing things. We can see though, in each database, we have now run a command with P1 equals 128. So each database right now is going to have one cached plan of, okay, you executed this procedure, and it's going to see it as a T-SQL statement. Now, if I run it for P1 equals 2, I am now executing this string that's like, oh, okay, I see this string as well. And I see, this is not a parameter. I am executing that string. So yes, the stored procedure still has a parameter, but I'm adding in extra calls to it. So in this case, it's not a huge deal, but what if this was a select statement? If this was a select statement, making it a parameterized select statement with the SP execute SQL thing could reduce the amount of execution plans that are created in each database. Maybe dramatically, if I was going to run this with, P1 equals values from 1 to 1 million, right? It could change between 1 million plans and 1 plan. Now, in this case, it's really not a big deal. We're executing it twice, right? So in this case, if it's something you're really like, it's a one-time thing, you're going to execute it like once, just do whatever's right. But often making it parameterized SQL so that you're not compiling it each time, you're not generating execution each time. Generally, that means you often want to default to using SP execute SQL. Now, like I said, there's exceptions to everything because sometimes execution plan reuse gets slow because of parameter sniffing. So sometimes you want to add something in that maybe isn't reusing plans, but you have to make sure, hey, we're not going to, generate tons and tons of different plans. So it gets a little complicated. If you're just starting out with this, for the purpose of this example, I would say the main things to know are generally when you're working with dynamic SQL, if you're doing something like dynamically calling a procedure that's just in another database, consider using, I'm going to set the variable to the 3-part name and execute the variable, right? And I can just, in this case, do that in my loop very, very simply. Nice, simple code. If you're not just, looping through databases and executing a stored procedure, but instead you're looping through databases and running a select, an insert, or a delete, the one I would consider first in that case would be a model more like query number 1, where we're using a pattern that And I do want sample solution 1 here. My scroll down just scrolls a little too far. Sample solution 1 here is the one that called SP execute SQL, because often the ability of it to say, hey, I do want to parameterize this instead of you seeing literal values or whatever, often that is the best choice there. So I would start with that one when looking at it. Now, I always do whenever I'm looping through things, step back and think, is there a way to do this without a loop? Is there a way to write one query that could do this? And could I make that query efficient? Do I have to have a cursor? Do I have to have a while loop? That's always good to think about as well, for sure. But when you do need to use a loop, don't just assume while loops are going to be faster every time, right? Because loops have overheads however we run them. I hope that you have enjoyed this dynamic SQL challenge, and I'll see you again for a SQL challenge in the future. I'm Kendra Little from SQL Workbooks. Bye, folks.